So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first hangout of Emerging Futures, What's Next? And today we have with us an amazing guy that I'm so excited to introduce to you guys, Michael Vassar, the former president of the Singularity Institute. And now you're the founder of MetaMed, right?
Yes, I'm
Michael?
the founder and president of MetaMed.
And I met Michael at an event 4 months ago, and I've listened to his talk about AI, actually, artificial intelligence, and everything that Google is doing in buying robotic companies. But as Michael and I started talking more in Hangouts about what we'll be talking about in this Hangout, the conversation moved a little bit more towards robotics and humanity and medicine and social. So this will be tonight about everything. And if you guys are interested in more hangouts, leave comments in the comments so we'll know to invite Michael again. So the way the hangout is going to work is simply Michael and I are going to talk for 30 minutes. If you have any questions or comments about anything that we're talking about, please put them in the comments below. There's still room, I believe, for a few more people in the hangout if you want to join us. And that's it. And then it's going to be unscripted conversations. So let's get started. I asked Michael, how do you want me to introduce you? Because I know you as the former president of the Singularity Institute. And Michael said that he is more a behavior economist. But that's not really something that you like, Michael. How do you like to be introduced?
No, I was saying that people often call me a futurist, and I am okay with that, but I feel behavioral economics is closer to the core of my skill set and function. I do a lot of thinking about the behavior of rational actors and thinking about the behavior of actual people and looking for arbitrage opportunities, looking for ways that I can try to make these sorts of systems that economic theory says would exist and that our actual observation of humans says that they don't produce, and try to kludge together something like the efficient markets that the stories tell us should exist in the real world. Because the stories tell us that everything's great, and I think we have a pretty good theoretical model of what everything being great would look like. Actually, Slate Star Codex is great for this sort of thing, and they had a recent good article on economic utopia.
And I will share that, guys, in the comments, so don't worry about that. But before we dive into the specific, Michael, we started talking about the fire chat with Larry Page and Sergey, where Larry was answering the question, what will happen to society when technology catches up and there's more unemployment and there are more robots that are doing the work that people can do? What will people do? And Larry and Sergey started arguing about the answer, and you and I started talking about whether Google should be the answer to the economics, to everything that's happening in the world. So let's dive into that. Let's first share with me, share with me your thoughts of the fireside chat, and why do you think that Google should do everything?
Well, what I said was there was this conversation where, in particular, Vinod Khosla, Sergey Brin, and Larry Page were speaking, and this was publicized online. And Larry Page claimed that we have, from sociology, psychology, and anthropology, a pretty good model of what humans actually need and want in order to be happy and thrive. And that model tells us that really the things they need probably only need about 1% of the population to deliver. And people need work, they need the opportunity to have lives filled with meaning, but not very many people appear to be needed for production. So a major challenge facing society is how to give people more vacation, divide a small number of jobs among more people, and otherwise enable what's needed for production to be spread over more hands. And it seems to me that I'm always dazzled when I see someone looking at reality and seeing what's straightforwardly in front of their nose, because, as George Orwell says, to do so requires a constant struggle. And I do kind of expect that sort of thing from Page if I expect it from anyone. And so I'm excited. But I also feel that then there's something of a failure to propagate the literal statement. Because when someone says we need only 40 or 50% of the workers that we've got, that seems to me to suggest something like the sorts of solutions that he and Richard Branson are pursuing, where the existing work ought to be divided among more people in order to more satisfactorily employ people. And that seems congruent with our unemployment rates. It seems congruent with the stories that we have as a society about robotics removing jobs, because it doesn't look, according to the statistics, like we're seeing 80 or 90%, or certainly 99% robotics-driven and technology-driven unemployment. It looks like we're seeing 10 or 20 or maybe 40 or 50% robotics-driven unemployment.
So it's not really that just technology, right? It's more the way society is actually based right now, the way we are working as a society. It's not just that more technology is going to come to the market.
Well, I'm saying that society seems to be moving towards a theory that technology is causing unemployment. And that's an old theory. It goes back to older than the Luddites. But Page is saying, actually, we only need 1% of the workforce today with today's technology. And that's a very exciting claim in a variety of ways. First of all, it actually sounds true. It doesn't sound like a myth that society is making up in order to understand our experiences. While robotics-driven unemployment seems basically to me to be a myth that's driven by our need to understand our unemployment rate, etc. Second, it seems to suggest very different types of policy. So if we need 1% of the population working, one obvious thing that it suggests to me is that Google is already employing about 40,000 people, and they're hiring about 10,000 new people a year, I believe. Maybe they're employing 50 or 60,000 by now. And it looks to me like, IBM is less than half the size of Google, and it's employing 450,000 people. And 450,000 people times 100 is 45 million people. That's about a third of the total US workforce. So it seems kind of plausible that Google could, for instance, do hostile takeovers of companies that employ more than 1% of the US workforce. And then if it knew how to allocate those people, could literally replace all of the current workforce of the United States based on the simple model that Larry is offering. Now, that's not a compelling model, but it's at least worth exploring as a hypothesis, probably not worth betting Google on. But the existing workforce at Google of 40,000 people, if perhaps half of the new employees over the course of 3 to 5 years were allocated to a project of, let's try to do everything, folks, if the 1% theory is roughly true, then it suggests that they ought to be able to do everything in some fairly large part of the country or in some smallish country. So, there are countries with 1 million people. 1% of a million is 10,000. So if you this theory suggests that one ought to be able to hire a new workforce, go to some country of 1 or 2 million people and say, hey, would you, how about we try giving you everything that people can deliver through work for free, and you can figure out some cool thing to do with your time.
And then
I don't think any country would go for it, but they might. And Luxembourg, you can actually just rent out the country. So Luxembourg is a really small country that allows you to rent it out. So you don't need to get their permission. You can rent them out and then give them everything you want.
So, guys, for those of you who are watching, what do you think about that idea? What do you think about an idea that Google will rent a country and try to run it, only 1% of the population is actually working, and then the other 99% just figuring out what to do with their life. And this is a very interesting question, Michael, because a lot of kids growing up today, and many adults, we don't know what we want to do with our lives, and work is where the meaning comes from. Not just, there are a lot of people who working just for the meaning, not for the money. And I think that changes also with the millennia. So how do we help people figure out what to do with all the free time in the world?
Right.
And I think that is where you came with the use of humans as humans, right?
Yes. So fortunately, all of these problems have been thought about for centuries. And a particularly good instance of them being thought about came a lifetime ago from Norbert Wiener, the founder of cybernetics. So Wiener was one of the people who invented communication technologies and a lot of control theory, a lot of ways of roboticizing. And he wrote a book called The Human Use of Human Beings, which basically explains that humans are not ants. That's the metaphor that Wiener uses. And that it seems very similar to the metaphor that I was using that says that humans are not robots. But he explains that ants have to be functional from birth. So they don't have any real learning as a larva because their whole nervous system reshapes with a new morphology when they metamorphosize. And once they metamorphosize, they go immediately to work. And mammals usually spend about 1/12 of their lifespan learning, while humans spend about 2/5 of their lifespan learning before reaching full economic productivity. And this indicates that it's very unlikely that a social organization basically inspired by the assumption that humans are ants, a social organization that assumes that humans are more or less interchangeable parts, is an efficient, effective way of utilizing people. And yet, almost every way of scalably utilizing people, almost every way of using people, actually, the whole frame of using people seems to treat them as tools, as more or less interchangeable parts. And one could think of civilization as the process of progressively converting larger fractions of the population into ever more precisely sculpted, ever more well-controlled, and ever more identical, interchangeable parts. And if you're afraid that people are going to be replaced by robots, I think that the reason is that civilization consists of turning people into robots. And humans make much worse robots than robots do. But humans actually make much better humans than robots do. It's interesting because the science of productivity is all about robots. The word robot, of course, is Czech for worker, and it's coming from a cultural assumption that a worker is basically an interchangeable part. And
a little cog in the wheel.
Right. And if you look at the history of artificial intelligence, you see that expert systems have been considered to be a computer equivalent of an expert that is better at making decisions and making judgments than a human is within a mechanical context, within a robotic, automated, factory-like context. So by the 70s, expert systems were better than doctors, political analysts, or practically any other sort of expert at being an accountable, predictable judge, decision maker. And there was a consistent finding that experts made better judgments than undergraduates, and the best experts made as good decisions as the simplest artificial intelligence systems. And complicated artificial intelligence systems made much better decisions than any expert. And this has been true for 40 years now. But recently, Philip Tetlock, in his Good Judgment project, has shown that there exist amateurs who make much better decisions than the best expert systems. whose judgments are as much better than the best expert systems as the best expert systems are better than undergraduates. And it seems intuitive to him and most people who are looking at his data that what we're talking about is humans actually used as humans, paying attention to reality, as opposed to humans used as parts, paying attention to an institutional control system, being actually enormously far more powerful still than computers are. They're just not an accountable, reliable, official, authoritative way of doing things.
So
It's
Michael,
noteworthy that no one who is good at making predictions seems to become a recognized expert in the domains that people have looked at. This is the first study that's ever found people who are better at making predictions than machines. And the people who had found that were better at making predictions were amateurs, not experts. So my suggestion is probably 1% of the population using lots of robots, using lots of machines well, can actually replace all of the robots, all of the existing industrial systems can replace civilization. But that shouldn't leave everyone unemployed. That should just transform all of the little wooden boys into real boys and girls.
But that's the biggest problem, isn't it? Because I'm going to go a little bit extreme here. But isn't it many people would rather not think for themselves, would rather follow a leader, whether it's a religion leader or a political leader or a teacher or whatever it is, or a guru online or a business leader, and just let them do the thinking for them and, you know, have the herd mentality. So if you're asking a lot of people to start thinking for themselves, don't we need to give them some tools to get to the point where they can actually think for themselves?
Well, maybe. I'm not sure. I mean, the proposal that I'm making is that the things that are provided by having a system and leaders think for you probably can be provided better by machines thinking for you.
And that's the challenge, right? Because we are thinking that, looking at society today, that there might going to be a machine that thinks better than, you know, some policemen do.
Right. And so if machines are a effective, evidence-based improvement on police, my guess is that the best thing to do would be use machines instead of police as our way of keeping social order. And I will mention the movie Robocop recently, because it was a really good movie that portrayed the politics around that and the double talk associated with the politicians and corporations and marketing associated with that in a shockingly entertaining and realistic way. And it's a great example of the thing I was talking about, how these visions developing about 30 years ago, because the original movie came out about 30 years ago, and the remake's coming out now. And it really remains pretty similar to the original movie. Anyway, so my impression, if you look at traditional societies, is that people don't necessarily need someone to think for them, even if they're not very good at thinking. So my impression is that for the most part, hunter-gatherers and shepherds and farmers just don't rely on thought very much. They get by fairly well, like every animal gets by fairly well, on having a brain. And, you know, their brains are actually very intelligent. Just like a squirrel can pretty much manage to take care of itself as long as the environment is producing the things that it needs, a human with 100 times a squirrel's brain is also pretty much able to take care of itself as long as it's in an environment that provides the things that a human needs. What it's not necessarily able to do is coordinate to produce all of those things. So what I'm suggesting is that if we don't need to produce all of those things, if that production function can be carried out by a fairly small number of people, then people can spend their time taking care of other human beings, which is probably people are a lot better at taking care of the elderly than nursing homes are, if they have the time to. Evidence shows overwhelmingly that people are a lot better at taking care of their children than schools are. Like, homeschooling and unschooling is overwhelmingly better at getting people able to read and able to do arithmetic and able to participate in society than schools are, based on essentially all of the research that's been done. And really, it looks to me like most of these supposed jobs we have in our society are something like turning people into robots to do an inadequate job at fulfilling basic human needs. And then, because they do an inadequate job, those needs never get fulfilled. So there's always a call for more robots. And so more people to be pulled away from being human, which is what would actually fulfill those needs, and turned into robots that can't fulfill them.
So I love where this is going, and I want to pause for a second. In 10 minutes, guys, we're going to open it up for unscripted conversation. So thank you for all the comments in the chat and the comments on the page. I'll bring them in. But do you think to get to that level of a society where robots are taking care of all our basic needs in order for us to be happy and act as humans, do we need to give up a lot of our privacy and let the robots know a lot about us in order for them to fulfill all our needs? Or is there some kind of a balance between what's private and what's shared and what's the common knowledge?
So I actually tend to think that privacy is one of these fake issues. And this is what brings me back to, I guess I'm going to go back to Robocop. Mm-hmm. So in the movie Robocop, there is a robotic police forces are capable of occupying countries and enforcing order and spying on people extremely well. And the politicians fight against this by talking about how a robot doesn't have a heart, isn't capable of feeling guilt, isn't capable of being responsible for its actions. And so the company builds a robot that has a ability to take responsibility because it has a human brain and heart inside. And it's still a robot. All of its actions are controlled by the machine. But because of quirks of human neurology, it's a machine with a human brain that's capable of taking responsibility and claiming to have done the things that the machine does, which is a really funny idea. But I think that what it's pointing at is, so there's an actual need in the movie. The need is for the US not to be occupied the way Iran is being occupied, by incredibly intrusive robotic soldiers. And that real need is not that easy to express in simple buzzword talking points. So in order to define and organize the opposition, people just hit upon a fake explanation for what's bad about this. The actual bad thing is that we don't want unlimited police power. The actual bad thing is that we don't want to live in a police state.
Right.
And robots, you can make as many robots as you want, while you have a practical limit to how many police you can have around. And I feel that a lot of political issues work this way, where people have an agenda that makes some sense, but they explain it in ways that don't make any sense, but which are relatively good marketing. And then the result of that is the dialogues become worthless. Everything is about these marketing terminology. Anyway, so privacy, everything that we see indicates that almost everyone doesn't mind sharing an endless number of selfies on Facebook. And almost everyone doesn't mind buying things online. And whatever people are used to, however much available information there is about someone, as long as people are used to it, they're fine. It seems like what people are legitimately worried about is something more like agents with agendas who have information asymmetry being able to unilaterally target them for condemnation structured around society's existing hypocrisy. So there are a wide variety of aspects of the human condition that we don't talk about very well or very honestly, especially things having to do with sex. And there are possibly a large number of behavioral patterns which, if described unsympathetically by someone with accurate information and presented unsympathetically by someone with accurate information, can target for scapegoating the large majority of fairly normal people with a narrative about their behavior being very abnormal. And people are legitimately worried about that. But that's not really thinking about that as privacy. That's not. It's much more concrete than that. And people are legitimately worried about spam. They're legitimately worried about being interrupted and intrusively bothered and forced to submit and reminded that they are subject to the arbitrary power of an unaccountable and invisible other. And once again, this is fairly concrete, but
I think the fear is more kind of like, what was that movie with Minority Report? You know, where you get to places where we are now carrying monitoring devices on our body, right, with wearable technology.
Yep.
We call it, we don't call it tracking devices, we call it exercise devices, right? But they monitor everything. And all that information is not going back to your phone, it goes back to the server to analyze it as an app. So we are voluntarily giving all our vital signs and our whereabouts and everything about us, right? With the selfies and everything else. I mean, even the glucose levels in your blood with the contact lenses, we give those freely because in the name of fitness and health. So it's very easy to get into all the details that you need in people, right? And get them very, let's say that, get them to give all their vital signs and their privacy away simply by letting us illusionally take better care of ourselves. So it's already here. But the fear is that you or someone that, like you said, we don't know, is going to take all these vital signs and then decide that I don't qualify for insurance, for example. Right? And that really is going to affect my life. And now go argue with a robot that is not a human and you can convey them one way or another.
Yeah, except I don't really feel, once again, that insurance thing seems like a made-up story argument.
I don't know. I mean, a lot of people can get insurance right now without all that stuff.
I think that everyone can get insurance based on the new health acts, because that the insurance companies aren't allowed to withhold insurance. Now, maybe they're able to charge. The whole issue is complicated because you're actually better off, based on every study that's ever been done, without health insurance than with it. So it's particularly complicated.
Yeah.
But let's say, I think that people might be more worried about mental pathologization, for instance. So to a really significant degree, people's rights can be removed by defining them as mentally ill. And as mental illness becomes tracked by correlating different statistical patterns in people's genes and in their hormone levels and anxiety levels, it's conceivable that we could end up in a context where basically if there are 1,000 ways in which, if there are 20 types of mental illness, each of which is statistically diagnosable by a 2 standard deviation from the norm along any 3 of 20 dimensions, it seems possible that we could be in a situation where everyone could be declared mentally ill based on some statistical pattern in their blood work and anxiety levels, and essentially stripped of rights. And I think that, I mean, it's not that long ago when our government lobotomized tens of thousands of citizens for mental illness. And it's even less time when we put 1% of the population in mental institutions and drugged them with horrible old psychiatric drugs. And, the track record of modern states with respect to mental illness has not been good or okay or bad. It's not obvious that there is a sharp line between what the Soviet Union did and what the US did. That, it looks like a continuum with a lot of shades of gray, and, Stalin being worse than Truman, but Truman maybe being worse than Brezhnev. And,
like the list of world's evil. Let me open it up for the panel for a second, because this is becoming very interesting. Gidon, you want to jump in? And by the way,
Sure.
Before you do, hold on. Alex, thank you so much. She's watching the Hangout, and she just commented that you might be interested in the topic. So I'm glad you're here. Go for it.
So this is really interesting. I have so many different notes. I don't even know where to jump in, Michael. But I'm going to start off just because earlier on you said that you were a behavioral economist. So my question is, let's say that we do get to a world where there's only 1% of us actually working, and I assume drawing some type of wages from that. The thing I keep having trouble figuring out is, where does the money come from to make other people's, the 99%, be able to survive economically?
All right. So that is a critical concern that people legitimately have. And my basic model, I guess I would characterize as, if it turns out that 1% of the people can provide all of the production, then it more or less follows from that it's really not that expensive to adequately take care of the material needs of 100% of the people. It only requires the work of 1% of the people to do so. And my expectation is there will always be more than 1% of the people who, out of pride and drive to be productive, would more or less work, and affiliation, desire to be part of something, would want to work and do that productive work. So I think it more or less can be given away freely. And there's a lot of things. I don't think that the world's wealth is distributed in such a way that it can all be given away freely. But it does seem to me that, well, Google talked about cars, so let's use this as an illustrative example. If 3% of the current automobile fleet could be, with robotic cars, could be a replacement for the existing automobile fleet, well, that sounds like bad news for car companies. And car companies have involve an enormous amount of aggregate employment, but they also involve an enormous aggregate market cap. So let's say someone were to produce 3% of the current auto fleet of robotic cars that never wear out, and short sell all of the car companies with a fairly large amount of leverage. And I think they could afford to give away the robotic cars and pay for the robotic cars forever on the interest on the money made by shorting the existing car companies. And I think that this could be done with, say, solar power too. Let's say, so Toyota now has a $70,000, 100 kilowatt hydrogen fuel cell powered car. So let's say we make solar power double in efficiency 3 more times, and we get down to a 30 cent per kilowatt, 180. So divide by 8 is 25 cent per kilowatt, roughly, solar cell. Now, at that price, per watt, at that price point, I think we can just use solar power to electrolyze water, compress it in carbon fiber storage tanks, and as hydrogen, and power hydrogen fuel cells, such as the ones that exist in current Toyota hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, to replace the grid and to replace oil. And given that there are trillions and trillions of dollars of aggregate market cap in the existing oil companies and in the existing oil reserves, I think that just put options on the oil companies and put options on the existing oil reserves and other very aggressive short selling could allow a company to capture the net present value of the future of basically the world's economy, and use that to capitalize a new global ecosystem that was relatively equitably owned because there wouldn't really be much connection to the past. I basically think that existing wealth, almost without exception, takes the form of claims on a fraction of the existing economic pie, assuming no major disruption in how things are done. And the rights are constructed in such a manner that by betting against the continued existence of the existing economic pie and being right and replacing the existing economic pie that way, you can, I believe, legitimately and legally capture ownership of the entire pie and do whatever seems reasonable with that.
Gidon? Oh, just a quick follow-up. I think that's fascinating. I don't even know how to process that. I gotta stew on that a little bit, just to see if it's even feasible, if there's enough capital there to do that. But it's a really interesting idea. So my follow-up question.
Numbers.
What's that?
I'll give you some numbers. So
yeah.
A hexayurt tridome is a simple piece of modular desert architecture that my Burning Man paradigm has prototyped for the last several years. It consists of sound and heat insulating solar reflective panels that can be transported by truck and deployed in a day with 550 square feet of living space and a high ceiling. And I'm pretty sure that a double scale one with 2,000 square feet of living space and a very high ceiling would be an adequate dwelling by almost all global standards and could still be deployed in a day by a reasonably competent person. It costs less than $1,000 to make, so let's a double scale one costs less than $4,000 to make, and combined with modern flat screen TVs with another factor of 5 or 10 reduction in cost for an ultra high definition screens, what we're left with is something like a average size contemporary American house with the appearance of being located anywhere in the world with all around walls, totally thermally insulated, total atmospheric control, cost of deployment anywhere in the world of about $10,000. And with cheap solar panels, you can power that pretty much anywhere in the world. And with cheap solar panels, you can do things like converting oxygen to ozone, or running current through and electrolyzing waste products, centrifuging them, and recycling pretty much all organic waste. So I think that is an example of the sort of technology that is within reach, pretty easy to engineer, Like the cost of building one slightly modified version of an automobile, for the cost of engineering the 2016 Toyota Corolla, and with the level of engineering skill required to engineer the 2016 Toyota Corolla, it would probably be possible to engineer a house that would cost less than a Toyota Corolla, and that could be deployed more easily and be adequate for any climate, pretty much anywhere in the world where there's a reasonable amount of free space. And, you know, this is just one example of what we can do with today's technology. I believe someone 3D printed a car in something like a day, a couple days ago, in the first 3D printer with a 40 pound per hour output. And 3D printed cars are incredibly efficient. I believe it's called Local Motors is the company. But very exciting. Basically, all of our old technologies are obsolete. They just, you know, haven't been scaled. And I think that news of the obsolescence of the old world via economic logic equals capture of the current economic value of the old world.
So basically, we're just not efficient enough today.
Basically, people are making art projects rather than making economic warfare. Like, people, I'm sort of saying make war, not play. You know, the things like General Motors should be blown out of the water rather than bailed out by the government and let continue to linger and spin their metaphorical wheels. You know, the way existing business finances new developments is oriented towards new technologies being developed by startups and then captured through acquisition by incumbents. And there is another way, which is, I think, metaphorically much more like warfare, oriented towards incumbents, you know, acquiring the value of the companies they replace through leveraged attacks and economic attacks. Anyway, Mia, you have a comment.
This may sound crazy, but this almost just sounds like a socialist society, though. We're taking out competition in a way because there's just going to be this across the board. We all get our little outfits and our little cars or whatever. Talk to me about that.
So I think of my perspective as, let's create an anarcho-socialist society in the late 2020s through by the economic textbook, within the existing legal framework, business activity. Like it looks like the law as it currently exists allows for a company or a sovereign wealth fund or pretty much any economic player that wants to play totally within the rules, but a little bit aggressively and a little bit disruptively for real rather than the sort of fake disruption that they do in Silicon Valley. And, you know, own everything. And since owning everything is a lot of responsibility, and no one really wants that much responsibility, it seems like the sensible thing to do once you own everything is give it away for the most part. Just keep what you can actually hold, which is probably not very much. So what about the individual? Where does our unique voice come in? Mm-hmm. I guess my basic perspective is that right now individuals have practically no voice because there is a global society, and my story is mixed with the story of 7 billion people. So we all have to compete to be one of the 10 or 20 mythic storybook characters who are supposedly doing things. And in a healthy society, my story would only be mixed with 7,000 people instead of 7 billion. And I wouldn't need to be competing with an enormous world of people in order to have a story. My story wouldn't be about the march of mankind and the progress of mankind. My story would be about my local high school or my local PTA and my local Dairy Queen and my local church or whatever. It would be about the things that affect directly the lives of the people around me. And like the population of the Roman Empire or the Chinese Empire throughout almost all of its history, I wouldn't need to know who was emperor. I wouldn't need to know what wars were supposedly being fought. I wouldn't need to know anything about some sort of a big picture. I could pay attention to a world that I could actually understand and not have to fight to be one of the superheroes ruling a world that I was incapable of understanding.
Glenn,
So,
Michael, this is Glenn. How you doing?
well, thank you.
Something that it seems to me, and I wonder if you agree with this, is that to a large degree this is already happening.
Yep.
And so what I mean is that, you and I talked about the other day that how 2012 was the best year ever, right? And that's invisible actually to most people. Because we're focused on local problems. We're focused on the situation in the West, in the United States. We're in this economic kind of downturn. In the meantime, in the rest of the world, global wealth is going up just dramatically. And I think that one way that our local economic troubles could be understood is that right at the moment, what's happening is that as a result of breakthroughs in communications and the internet, that wealth is just flowing out of the West into the rest of the world, right? At some point, that situation will equalize, and then it just keeps going up and up and up, and that when you have, I mean, a lot of this is just going to be dictated by economics, right? Like so.
Well, I don't really think so.
Okay.
I don't really think that economics right now is very much in play. Like, the economy that we live in today seems to me to be a more or less completely controlled, more or less completely centralized affair with a mythology of free markets and distributed information processing. Mm. And it seems to me that if you look at the US economy circa 1945 and the Soviet economy circa 1945, they're almost indistinguishable. They just have different ideology and mythology. And if you look at the US economy today, it's not that different from the US economy circa 1945. Eisenhower's complaints about the military-industrial complex were very hard to respond to. And after a generation, people forgot what a real economy would look like. But we still have textbooks that analytically describe what a real economy could look like. And we still teach our economics students theories about the economy of the 19th century, as if that was the economy that we still live in. So it seems to me that if we could build 19th century people, we could build instead of new Soviet men, the 19th century people we built could build a 19th century economy very easily, and that would kind of look like, some kick-ass steampunk fun.
Mm-hmm. Well, so you are proposing that we're essentially not in a different position than the citizens of the Soviet Union were under their regime, and that we should rise up and wage war against this situation. So if I accept those terms, what should I do? Like, what is the sensible move for a person who actually wants to make a difference?
Keep in mind, I'm advocating a very lawful, very orderly, capitalistic sort of war. Mm-hmm. As far as I can tell, we don't need to, you actually can, given the current supersaturation of technology, make an omelet without breaking any eggs. We are extremely well positioned to okay, so if I was going to say what the most sensible thing I would like an extremely large number of people to start doing would be, if I had to give it in a very short name to it, I would say set up an import-export business. Set up an import-export business, travel in East Asia and India, and learn about manufacturing.
It's basically an Amazon business. Set up an Amazon store.
Set up an Amazon store. Set up an Alibaba store. I mean, Amazon's great, but no, Amazon's already got its shit together. Like Amazon.
But as the individual, you know, as the individual, if you want to start selling something, you will be manufacturing something in China or India. You'll be selling it through Amazon. They'll be doing the distribution for you, but you'll still be creating, manufacturing, marketing, all that stuff.
Right, that seems basically right. But you can do the marketing too if you want. You'll learn a lot that way. Mm-hmm. But sell solar panels. Okay, here's a very low-hanging fruit one. Partner with someone Spanish-speaking and start selling, install yourself, start producing an info product to do home installation solar power in Puerto Rico. So in Puerto Rico, you have the lease to own solar model done by companies like SolarCity is aiming at high net worth people, and it's aiming at people who don't really need to save small amounts of money, so it needs to be driven by identity and marketing. And meanwhile, we have high human capital people who are capable of doing basic minimal electronics and installing things themselves, and who have unreliable power, and who are paying 26 to 29 cents per kilowatt hour for their power, so who could repay their cost of installation in 1 year, and who have are cash crunched. It really ought to be possible to use government credits and use an info product to get people, I guess, to get people $5,000 cash in hand right now and get them a radical reduction in their electric bill for the rest of their life and make you, the distributor, a profit, and push the Puerto Rican power company into a much-deserved early grave, where it already has, I believe, $9 billion of bonds outstanding and is backed by the local government. That's the sort of thing. Moving the world, moving especially the relatively anarchistic, semi-developed parts of the world to off-the-grid, autonomous, local production, and a reasonable amount of personal economic sufficiency. You know, like cash in hand now plus free power and being off the grid is a real life changer of a sort that's much more repeatable than the stuff that info products normally sell. And I think that it could be distributed through the school system, but it could also, an info product is probably the low-hanging fruit. And if you go onto Alibaba, last I checked, it was possible to find basic solar panels for 25 to 35 cents per watt, which is crazy low.
Michael, are you suggesting that we will become the 1% that is actually fueling the economy and changing it towards the world where 99% is not doing anything, and we will be the 1% that is actually moving?
No, as I said, should Google do everything? The answer is no. Google should make all the things, which is actually a really small part of everything. I think that Google should just do nature's job, and people should do the jobs of humans. So
no, but I mean,
nature's job to make the things for hunter-gatherers, and it's nature's job to distribute the things. And, you know, nowadays Amazon can distribute the things. And nowadays, it seems to me, I don't know, there's probably a few major industrial companies. I'm going to just say Panasonic for convenience. Panasonic can make the things, and Amazon can distribute them. And, you know, it seems like if 1% of the population is required to make and distribute the things that provide most of the services that can be provided by things, then watching over people, helping them to aggregate, helping them to have opportunities to, do their art projects, which can serve for grist for the mill for creativity and production. And, basically, most of our jobs now are service industry jobs. And most of the service industry jobs are just cut-rate versions of the services that people provided to their families back when people had families, because they weren't all being turned into robots in order to make things that no one needed. And so I don't think of it as people won't have anything to do. People, as far as I can tell, in the rainforests and in Africa and in Kyrgyzstan and in all of the parts of the world where they aren't industrial, don't complain about, woe is me, there's nothing to do.
There's a question from one of the people in the audience, Michael, and she's asking, the element that I missed is why should the 1% want to spend their time carrying the other 99% of the population? Doesn't the existing economy pie only exist as a result of millions of people working? Without them working, there is a tiny economic pie. And there is a long, slow degradation of infrastructure, distribution system, engagement between humans that has any value beyond sexual involvement and lurking, trying to figure out what to do with themselves 18 hours a day.
All right. So if I were to try to unpack that, it sounds like they're saying aren't you calling for the end of the Protestant work ethic?
Well, but why would 1%, I think that's the question, why would 1% want to do all the work for the 99%?
I think that, well, Page's estimate was that it takes 1% of the population today. My guess is it takes a lot less than 1% of the population in 20 years, if it takes 1% of the population today. And the answer is, as far as I can tell, most work that is worth doing, people are willing to do for free. If it's, most work that's worth doing, people are willing to do for free if they're allowed to do a good job, and if they are given some respect and, recognition for doing so. And we don't need everyone to agree to do it. I'm not saying the best 1% of people should do it. I think that, we could probably get by with only child labor. I mean, we could probably get by with only 14-year-old child labor. Or only child labor during summer vacations, as if there were still school, which of course there shouldn't be, for, high school students. 1% is a ridiculously small fraction of the population. And, people pay to play around with construction equipment. They pay a lot of money to play around with construction equipment in, playing at being in construction worker camps. People build Burning Man in a month and then burn it down and build it again.
That sounded actually like the society that you were talking about, Burning Man. Everything is being taken care of, and then all we do is build art and talk to each other and marry ourselves, and and then what?
Well, Burning Man with better weather and with more permanence, and everything's not taken care of at Burning Man. I mean, practically nothing is taken care of.
No, I know, but I'm saying if you're saying
practically nothing.
Right. But in your ideal, everything will be taken care of, plus it'll be just Burning Man with everything being taken care of.
I mean, yeah, the thing is practically nothing. I mean, everything being taken care of. I think that right now almost nothing is being taken care of. Right now, it's impossible to buy medical care unless you go to MetaMed. It is literally impossible to get a doctor to use the training that they received in medical school and to use the fruits of thousands of years of scientific and cultural progress to figure out what your health problem is and figure out what evidence says will treat it. Because we have systems that are oriented towards people demonstrating that they are responsible instead of doing the thing that feels like a good idea and talking it over in a non-authoritarian way and trying to help. Right now, nothing is being taken care of except people's need for jobs. And they only need the jobs because we have a social theory that says you're not entitled to be a part of our society without a job. And people only need to be part of the society because they don't want to be murdered like people at Waco who drop out of society get murdered. But the actual legal system we've got doesn't technically, theoretically allow people to be murdered like they are at Waco. So, okay, let me be more precise. Panasonic can make the things that need to be made, and Amazon can distribute the things that need to be distributed. And, you know, your grandmother can read Wikipedia and provide routine health care. And the existing doctors can be organized by MetaMed to do detective work and provide non-routine health care. But Google's job, fundamentally, is to provide security. Because right now, like any society, one needs a judicial system, and one needs an executive branch, and one needs an intelligence agency, and one needs an army. And the only judicial system and executive branch and intelligence agency and army we've got any prospects for having anytime in the near-term future looks to be Wikipedia and Google. So, you know, what's Google's job? Google's job is to allow people to document and distribute accurate information about their lives so that they can actually, you know, not be part of a society that doesn't need them and doesn't want them, because, you know, and be confident that the society won't just kill them without giving them any respect for their rights. And all it has to do that is continue existing, continue making it possible to to give voice, to make YouTube videos. Like, I don't think Waco could happen right now. Waco would have a YouTube news channel, and if they saw people making crazy accusations, they could set up cameras in their compound and demonstrate that the accusations were bullshit, and, you know, hire some lawyers, and things would work out. I guess Wikimedia would need to provide some sort of a legal defense fund to make those lawyers do something. But
so as Victoria is asking, Michael, she's asking, do you think that Google should issue everyone a basic income instead of the government doing so?
Well, right now Google doesn't have the money to issue anyone a basic income. They're not nearly infinitely rich, and people don't need that much money anyway. It would be I mean, in the sort of society that I'm proposing, I think that in the sort of society I'm proposing, what I'm imagining is something more like the 10 surviving corporations and 3 surviving sovereign wealth funds owning all of the money, and money being therefore worthless and useless. You know, Google and Panasonic wouldn't need to issue a basic income because there wouldn't be anything you could buy with the money they had anyway. And, you know, people who felt like, you know, providing missionary work foreign aid a la the Peace Corps could distribute things to the few parts of the world where there was some difficulty with getting things anyway. But most of the time things would get where they wanted without much effort. Like, you don't want to give people cryptocurrencies should enable trade. You don't really need fiat currencies to do trade. And the sort of wealth extraction I describe in my essay, Corporate Cornucopia, I guess maybe you should Google Corporate Cornucopia.
And I'll put that in the comments as well.
Yeah, this was using the idea of nanotechnology, but it really doesn't require nanotechnology. Nanotechnology just makes it easier. that sort of system would allow. I mean, the thing is, if you capture all of the money, you've basically caused money to cease to exist. And
it sounds like going back to, what do you say, downsizing in a developed world and upsizing in a developing world. That's Rashid. You want to jump in and explain that? And then, guys, we are 5 minutes past the hour, so we will finish after this question. Go for it.
Yes, Michael. It did sound like that is what you're proposing to a certain degree, a downsizing a bit in the developed world, 3D printed cars, perhaps maybe a tiny house. There's a tiny house movement, reducing the size of the house will reduce your carbon footprint, so on and so forth. And then the upsizing or right-sizing in the developing world, which I don't think is a bad idea at all. I think that's a very worthy goal. I just wanted to say that I couldn't help but think of an oil-rich sheikdom, for example, in the Gulf, where there's plenty of money but very little work. So everyone is given, not everyone, but the citizens of the country are often given quite a good salary and benefits and what have you, but there isn't a lot of work for them to do, and a lot of it's state-run companies, and then there's still not much work to do. And then there's this worker class that does all the building and the production and things like that. Yeah, it just seems like you would need to build within the culture a desire to create, to build, not just simply sit back and accept a salary and maybe become intellectually lazy. Don't create and have others produce for you, since they're willing to produce it.
So I'm not really proposing downsizing or upsizing. I'm speculating that whatever people want, whatever can even be marketed to people, can actually be produced in enormous excess fairly cheaply with more or less today's technology. That it's only through a combination of artificial demand and artificial scarcity that the market values of most goods don't actually turn out to be zero, but that given the existing supply of goods in the world and something like the natural demand curve, the actual value of practically everything is zero. So, I just bought my fiance a mink coat because it cost $300. And I remember when that would have cost $5,000 or $6,000. And I think that you'll just find that if you look, mink coats that cost $5,000 or $6,000 now cost $300. And the same is true of grand pianos. Like all of the sort of high-end luxury goods of my grandmother's time. If you want to make your own diamonds, you can buy the capital equipment and produce millions and millions of dollars worth of diamonds at home in 6 months. And then De Beers will send people to your door. So the scarcity of diamonds is more artificial scarcity. The very few things are actually scarce. Oil is the main one, and once solar scales up a little bit more, oil won't really be relevant, and there just won't be any scarce things. There will be land. Land will be scarce. I can imagine the Esalen Institute might have a market value of, $100 billion of Bitcoin, in terms of value equivalent Bitcoins in 40 years, because there just aren't that many locations quite like it. And there will be entrenched patterns of human activity. MIT is scarce. No one really knows how to make another MIT, and God, have people tried. And Hollywood is scarce in the same way. It's not clear why people can't make another Hollywood, but I think empirically we can say they can't. But so fixed superorganisms, you might say, are sometimes unique, but goods are basically never very scarce. And I'm not saying that everyone should give up their McMansion to save the planet by living in a mini house. I'm saying that no one would want as many McMansions as already exist if people weren't being pressured to live in them. And
I think
there
are some models of that kind of like show what you're talking about, like Airbnb and Uber, where people are just coming together and providing services to people who want the services, and it's much cheaper than the hotels or the taxis, and they're disrupting the economy, but it's all based on social interaction. Someone has to say that you are a great host. Someone has to say that you are a great guest in order for you to continue using the system. So there are systems that allow us to communicate with each other human to human and not just human to machine, kind of like assembly line of our life. And I think on that note, I want to thank you, Michael, for showing up this late and being the first guest, because we are 10 minutes later. So I want to thank you for staying longer. And I want to thank everybody who joined us in the Hangout and in the comments. Thank you so much for your engagement. We will repurpose this, of course, so you can re-listen. There was so much math in the Hangout. You need to watch and think about this again. And if you guys are interested in talking with Michael some more about artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and more topics that we haven't discussed yet, just let me know in the comments, and I will invite him again. So, Michael, people can find you where?
I'm on Facebook. I'm often on Skype.
You're on the F word. We're not using the F word in here. No, I'm kidding.
Sorry. Yeah, I am trying. I resolved to transition to Google Hangouts after our conversation, and you're doing great marketing, Fat.
Thank you.
I think that I said my specific quote was, "What would WWDHD?" And the answer is, DH would pay the upfront costs to switch from Facebook to Google Hangouts.
There you go.
So where can people contact me? I don't know. I speak from time to time at different places. I'll be around. I don't. I've got an email. You can ping me at my name at Gmail, and I'll talk.
And maybe you'll come to Google Plus, and people can actually follow you and interact with you.
Yeah, I have a Google Plus account I've set up. I'll just have to get in the habit of using it.
There you go.
Thank you.
So guys, go follow Michael. The more followers, hopefully he will be here more often. Loving Hangout, so hopefully we'll see him again. And again, thank you so much. This is the first Hangout in a series of emerging futures. I hope to see you in the next one.
All right.